What if I were to bow my knee in a football game during the national anthem? It would make a lot of people uncomfortable, no matter which side you come down on, because it raises questions, all kinds of uncomfortable questions, and we don't like the tension that questions create. But did you know that much of Jesus' ministry was of exactly that Jesus came to raise uncomfortable questions, that Jesus didn't just come to give us the answers, but to raise uncomfortable questions? There's a story in the Bible. There's several groups of people clamoring around Jesus in this house. And one of those groups is trying to get to Jesus. It's his family, because they think he's gone out of his mind. Literally, they are trying to stage an intervention/kidnapping, because Jesus has been raising uncomfortable questions with the religious leaders. And they can see where this is headed. Not only is it going to destroy their family reputation, which was very, very important in those days, but they're also they're afraid for Jesus. And they don't get what he's talking about. Because they're as embedded in their culture as everyone else. And they just don't understand what's going on. So Jesus is raising questions. The religious leaders are so upset with him, and they're so polarized at this point that they actually say that Jesus is the devil. You know you're polarized when when one group calls the other group Satan. So what had gotten these religious leaders so upset? Well, if you look back, this is in the Gospel of Mark. If you look back a couple chapters earlier, the religious leaders are upset because Jesus pronounced forgiveness of sins over someone. They called that blasphemy. When you dig deeper, see, it's not just a theological objection. It's an issue of authority. It's an issue of power. It's an issue of money. Because the only ones who really had the authority to forgive sins was God, but through the temple system. And that temple system was controlled by the religious leaders. So when Jesus pronounces that he has the authority to forgive sins, it begins to question their control. See, they were part of what I would call a sin management system, where they were in control, and the people had to come to them to have their religious services and needs met. And the religious leaders were profiting big time from this. And so when Jesus comes and questions their authority, it's a big deal. In fact, did you know that the debts of the people, which were numerous, common people, the records of their debt were kept in the temple, the Jewish temple. One of the first things that people do when there's the Jewish war is they go in and they burn all the records of debt. So you can see why this was so upsetting to the religious leaders. It raises questions about their authority. I mean, imagine today if Christ came along and said that he had the authority to cancel all credit card debt. We would go, yay, but I imagine that the credit card companies would start lobbying very hard and very fast for student loan debt. Just think about how much of our economy is based on debt, and then those who benefit from that. And you try to get a sense of why they were so upset with Christ. And it repeats itself. In the time of Martin Luther, for instance, before he started raising uncomfortable questions, the church also had a sin management system, making money hand over fist from the common people through the selling of indulgences and other things. And so they wanted Martin Luther dead. In fact, the only thing that saved him was he was hidden away so they couldn't find him. Why? Because he questioned the sin management system. He raised uncomfortable questions. In fact, he nailed 95 questions to the Wittenberg door. You see, Christ comes to raise uncomfortable questions. That's what he does. Much of his ministry is raising questions that we don't want to look at. Because the truth is, all of us have put our faith in something. Right? It might be our political system, our political ideology, the flag, our values, and what we think and feel are really sacred came from somewhere. Even our family system has a big influence on that. And there's good in that, but there's also the capacity to be blinded by that. So Christ comes to raise uncomfortable questions so that we can begin to get outside of what we've been told and step into the greater freedom of what's right and what's true. And I wish Jesus would help us a little bit more, because sometimes he seems to play by the rules, right, of the system, and then other times he doesn't. So one time, a man is healed, and Jesus heals a man, and he tells him to go to the temple, to go through the process that's been outlined, to show himself to the priest. So sometimes he follows the rules, but then other times, for instance, one time he heals on the Sabbath. And again, the religious leaders are really upset with him because that's breaking their rules. And Jesus says, well, is it bad to do good on the Sabbath? And Jesus seems to break the rules when the rules go against the demands of love. When a religious rule gets in the way of loving other people, then we need to question those rules. A new commandment that I give you, that you love one another as I have loved you. That's the highest priority for Christ. So he comes and he gets us to question. It's a question where our values and our priorities and our ideologies come from, and are they really fitted toward the demands of compassion? Or is it just a way to protect our self-interest and our pocketbooks, our piece of the pie? I was in a church once where they were in the midst of what's called a worship war. And unfortunately, this war is still going on. And it's between those who love hymns, old-style hymns, and those who like the praise music. This is largely a debate between, Xers and boomers and silence. I mean, it tends to be a generational issue. And I got to be the pastor of one of those worship wars. And so the old people say, well, this is sacred music, that other music's not, you can't use that, that's bad. And then the praise people would say, well, we have our music too, and, we struggle to worship. So I asked a question. I asked an uncomfortable question. I asked the younger people who love the praise music, would you be willing to have hymns because that's the loving thing to do, because that's how it allows older people to worship God? And then I asked the older people to say, would you be willing to allow a different style of music in order so that it would give younger generations the capacity to worship God in their way? Questions. Jesus always gets us to question what we consider to be sacred. Because there's no one more blind, says Jesus, than the one who thinks they see. The one who thinks they see is truly blind, says Jesus. Because then they can't see, because they can only see what they want to see. Questions get us outside the box. All of us have put our faith in something. So, how does Christ help us with that? Christ gives us the grace we need in order to handle the questions and in order to give compassion toward other people. You see, without that grace, we tend to be judgmental and critical of those we disagree with. My own spiritual journey, I've been wrong about so many things at the time I thought I was right about. My journey has been a very crooked path. But all along on that path was Christ, whispering in my ear uncomfortable questions and giving me grace when I was wrong. And I will still be wrong in the future. But when I look at that journey, then I begin to consider, that if Christ loves me on my crooked path and has given me grace, then he loves other people on their crooked path and will give them grace. In fact, I may struggle to love my enemies, but Christ does not. And when I experience that for myself, when I experience God's grace for myself in my journey, then I start looking at other people in the same way, and I can extend them grace, even if I disagree with their politics. And I maybe might ask them some questions that get us both thinking. Because Jesus said in that same scripture I mentioned, where that a house divided against itself cannot stand, that polarization is not going to get us anywhere. So I had an instance when I was working for Community Action, and part of my job was to respond to people, older people who needed services. And about once a week, about every 2 weeks, this older guy would call him, an old vet, and he was looking for something. And if I couldn't give him what he wanted, he would just hang up the phone and say, "Well, thanks a lot." That would be the end of the conversation. And this would happen about every couple of weeks. Well, part of my job, and I never met the man personally, part of my job was to go visit this man at his house, make sure he's getting his services and whatnot. So do you think I wanted to visit this guy? Do you think I had much grace for him? No, I did not. I dreaded. So I went to his house, and I pull up, and he's all alone, isolated, way off in the woods. And I'm walking over, and I can see him sitting in the garage. The garage door is open, and he's sitting in a wheelchair. He's got ramps all around his house to get into his house. And as I get closer, there's an old dog, and I mean a really old dog. He could barely bark. So I wasn't too afraid of the dog. He was an old dog. But this is the man's only companionship. I imagine he had pushed away lots of people in his life. And as I got closer to him, I began to feel his pain. And I began to have compassion. Now, not my compassion. My compassion's about this big. But I began to feel the compassion of Christ. Through the Spirit of God, I began to feel compassion for this lonely, isolated, angry, old man. And by the end of that time together, I would have went to hell and back to help this guy. Because of the grace that I had received. You cannot give away, folks, what you have not received. The grace of Christ is big enough for all of us. And when we experience that, we can handle any question.